Another episode of Potential Within. I'm Franco Cavaleri. I'm your host with Potential Within. I want to talk to you today about cholesterol. And this has been a little bit of a mysterious, misunderstood, yet there's so much research uncovering the value of controlling your cholesterol levels and maintaining levels within ranges that are acceptable by the medical community. Nevertheless, there is so much information that's polarized. If your body collects and circulates an excessive amount of cholesterol, can that be damaging to the body? Can that increase the risk of cardiovascular disease? And there's a lot of research, yes, showing that, but there's a lot of research showing that it does not. And there are reasons for it and possible isolated research programs that have demonstrated why. But I'm going to take this talk about cholesterol, and we're going to move towards the blue zones where people are living in excess of 100 years old, centenarians. This is where the blue zones in the world are where centenarians do reach an age of 100 years or more. And there's a lot of people who have formally researched from a molecular standpoint and research in terms of lifestyle and meta-analysis on these human beings and the way of life. Interesting thing that I've derived in terms of nutrient density, and I'll talk a little bit about what I've theorized and then did some research on to uncover some interesting facts. So let's talk a little bit about cholesterol. We'll start in there, and you know, the implication of elevated cholesterol in the body. There's one thing I want you to keep in mind as we preface this. Your brain contains in excess of 24 to 25% of the entire cholesterol in your body. 25%. That's a lot, considering that the brain makes up approximately 2% of your mass. So brain makes up about 2% of your mass, has about 25% of your cholesterol. I can tell you that cholesterol is critically important for brain development. And if cholesterol is mismanaged, especially during fetal development, you can actually miscarry. So that's how serious it is. Cholesterol plays an important role in the cell membranes. And I've heard ranges of descriptions as to what it does, whether it improves fluidity. And in fact, it doesn't improve fluidity. It actually improves the membranes density and rigidity, while the polyunsaturated fats and other fats that form phosphatides, the tails of those fats actually then create fluidity. Now, the interesting thing is that if you take trans fats and saturated fats, they will have tails on the phosphatides that are in our cell membranes that are straight. Saturated fats have a linear carbon chain, whereas polyunsaturated fats will have kind of a bent chain. And you think about your cell membranes. The cell membranes are made up of these polyunsaturated fats that are stacked like a deck of cards. You think of a deck of cards where these membrane fats, the phosphatides, are stacked to create this cell membrane and allow for fluidity. But if you have too many saturated and trans fats in particular, this is why trans fats are terrible, the cell membrane then becomes too rigid and things cannot go in and out, and we can cause problems in terms of metabolic function. Whereas the polyunsaturated fat that has a bent structure because of the polyunsaturated the unsaturated carbons, this bent structure allows for fluidity in the membrane. This is why PUFAs, polyunsaturated fats, are critically important in the diet, especially for the brain. And DHA, you've heard of docosahexaenoic acid, is critically important for the brain, as is EPA, primarily for the heart, but other tissues. But when it comes to cholesterol, cholesterol embeds itself in that membrane and then allows for these pores to be created and the membrane to have structure. And without it, the body cannot create neurons. And that's why 25% of your cholesterol resides in your brain. Another misconception is that that your dietary cholesterol will contribute to elevated cholesterol in the body. And this has to stop, because eggs, for instance, having a high cholesterol level but also supplying nutrients that are critical for cognition, including choline, fats, and other amino acids that are critical for cognition. That cholesterol that comes from the diet, including eggs, not more than 10% of that can end up in the dietary circulation. Think about it. All this cholesterol you may consume is not contributing to an elevated cholesterol in the body. Okay, so we need to forget that and not worry about eating eggs and then having a direct impact on cholesterol elevation, because they've actually shown in some research that eating an egg a day can improve IQ and performance throughout the day for many reasons, not only cognitive performance, but insulin performance and glucose management. And why is that? It's because of the fat content in that egg and the protein content offsetting any glucose in that meal to improve the body's capacity to control the glycemic impact of the meal. And this is why eggs are great in the morning. I mean, I usually will have 2 to 3 boiled eggs in addition to a small protein drink to take in between 30 and 40 grams of protein in the morning. And the eggs form a critical component of it because they supply fats, choline, and other vitamins and minerals, that dense source of vitamins and minerals that help to synergize that meal when the protein levels are that high. But the critical thing to take away from this that's very important in terms of the cholesterol contribution from your meal throughout the day is that that meal is not contributing to the elevated cholesterol that you're thinking it might do. And the fact is that there are other elements of the diet that will change the profile of your cholesterol to make it a higher risk for mortality and morbidity. I'll talk about that in a moment. But one thing to keep in mind is that the cholesterol throughout the body that's circulating is, if you think about 3 vessels, there's 3 vessels that we consider in the body. One vessel, the body's circulatory system for cholesterol, stays relatively consistent and confined. Very little transfer of cholesterol from the body to the brain and from the brain to the body, other than oxidized cholesterol, and I'll get into that in a moment. Oxidized cholesterol being oxysterols that can actually set in motion significant inflammation and cognitive problems. But let's back up a little bit and go back to the isolated vessels. The body cholesterol stays intact and circulates within the body. The brain cholesterol that's produced in the brain stays intact in the brain and circulates in the brain. And that cholesterol is utilized for turnover and regeneration, recovery, and repair in the brain. Without it, you can actually, there's a lot of research showing that Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, Huntington disease is associated with a reduced or a deficit in cholesterol. Now, if you go to the literature, you'll see there's some research showing that elevated cholesterol will contribute to those same diseases. So you can see how this is polarized. And it depends on what we're looking for in that research, because it is more likely that the oxysterol, the oxidized cholesterol and oxidized fats are contributing to inflammation in the brain and then causing damage and a progression towards disease. Because Alzheimer's, for instance, is highly characterized by an inflammatory process, which I've written 2 papers on it, and I speak to the heavy metals and their contribution to the oxidative stress in the body, specifically the brain, and then how they in turn result in the acceleration of inflammation and diseases, including Alzheimer's and others. Nevertheless, going back to cholesterol, the dietary factors that significantly impact cholesterol manufacturing in your body. Remember, not the dietary cholesterol, because less than 10% of that can end up in your body. So it's more or less other elements of the diet that will affect the health of your cholesterol profile. And therefore, the level of cholesterol, total cholesterol you have in your body is not necessarily a factor that contributes to morbidity. I mean, there are studies that say, hey, if your cholesterol level's up here, you have an increased risk for cardiovascular disease, an increased risk for mortality. Not that clear cut. For instance, HDL, high density lipoprotein. HDL we call the good cholesterol. It tends to take cholesterol from the periphery of the body to the liver for management and metabolism so that it can be expelled. Actually, there are studies that show if your HDL levels are too low, that you're at high risk for cognitive disorders, deficits of cognition, and including insulin mismanagement and at risk for diabetes. So again, an elevated cholesterol doesn't tell the whole story until you start to consider the different components of cholesterol. LDL, low density lipoprotein, at an elevated level is not dangerous to you until it is oxidized, until we're producing oxysterols from that, and they create an inflammatory process, a vicious cycle of oxidation and inflammation, which calls on the immune system that eventually begins to contribute to the development of atherosclerosis, or those sclerotic plaques that will have your fat bound to it and cholesterol bound to it. And so going back to the diet and how it contributes to cholesterol, trans fats in the diet. Trans fats are often used to harden candy, chocolate. Trans fats are a function of overheated and continuously boiled oils, for instance. Trans fats are used in confections, significantly used in confections. It was used a lot more in the past to create more stable oil or margarines or substitutes for butter, because it would create a hardening of an oil, for instance, that would be conducive as a spread. The problem is that those trans fats, not only do they interfere with cell membrane function, because remember I talked about that analogy of a deck of cards. If you stack a deck of cards, how are you going to get through that packed, dense deck of cards? And when you think about the cell membrane, these phosphatides made with trans fats or pure saturated fats, they represent that deck of cards where things are hard to penetrate, the fluidity changes. But with the polyunsaturated fats, rather than the trans fats, polyunsaturated fats, docosahexaenoic acid, eicosapentaenoic acid, these are the fish fats, linoleic acid, linolenic acid, these are the essential fats from flaxseed oil, for instance. These are bent structures that allow fluidity in the cell membrane and improve the state of your cardiovascular system for many reasons. It creates fluidity of the blood, increases bleeding time to allow the blood to move faster, and raises HDL levels. Now, we've talked a little bit about and this is like a bird's eye view on cholesterol. We're not going into the details, but we've talked about elevated cholesterol and the high risk for cardiovascular disease. But again, it's not that clear cut, because there's a lot of people that live with high cholesterol that have never taken a statin drug. Statin drugs are used to lower cholesterol. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, because there's a controversial subject matter and dialogue that revolves around the statin drug. Nevertheless, these statin drugs have significant side effects that the FDA has now recently forced warnings about, and that is increases the risk for diabetes and failure of blood sugar control. But there's a drug for that too, like metformin, glyburide. So, what's happened here is that we've become desensitized to the side effects of many of the primary drugs we might use, such as a statin drug to control cholesterol, because we know that we can control a secondary disease that may be caused by a statin drug, like diabetes, and therefore rely on metformin or other drugs to control the diabetes. And that's just a terrible way to go about taking care of your health, because really the interesting thing is that diabetes itself is not really considered a factor that contributes to cholesterol elevation, but it's massive. High glycemic index carbohydrates would cause an increase in cholesterol and a decrease. So it's a compounding effect. So over time, a decrease in HDL. Whereas things that were led to as dietary and lifestyle habits that helped reverse these things, such as olive oil. Olive oil will improve this, and this is an amazing fact. Olive oil, a monounsaturated fat, will improve HDL levels and help you manage cholesterol. This is a fat rather than saturated fat and trans fats that will increase cholesterol, the LDL, bad cholesterol, reducing HDL, the good cholesterol. So you can see how when we're talking about diet and lifestyle, that we have to really start considering how the lifestyle that we're incorporating into our program, our life, our daily, day-to-day activities, how they affect our health, and how we become so desensitized to that, because we know if we have an elevated level of cholesterol, which, it's possible it can increase, not for sure, can increase the risk of cardiovascular disease. We have a drug for that. Yet the drug itself contributes to secondary disease such as diabetes, cognitive deficits. In fact, that's one of the warnings by the FDA. And therefore, we say, well, it's fine because we have a drug for that. And yet that diabetes is now recognized as a factor that will create morbidity and increases the rate of morbidity and mortality over cholesterol elevation. And so the catch is that diabetic state and the diet that contributes to that diabetic state, such as a high glycemic index diet that's loaded also with saturated fat, that in itself raises your cholesterol levels to the point of dysfunction and changes the proportions of the LDL and HDL to the point of dysfunction. So I'm going to lead this conversation down real quickly to the path of the Mediterranean diet. And here's an interesting fact. There's been a lot of research and talk about how statin drugs over the last 7 to 8 years have been so overused that we're starting to see reduction in cardiovascular disease and death by cardiovascular disease. Yet, wait a second, nobody has really considered whether or not in the last 10 years the cessation or the reduction in smoking has contributed to the same. So is this reduction in cardiovascular disease a function of this cessation of smoking, or is it really the statin drug? Secondly, it hasn't changed. The fact has not changed that cardiovascular disease is the single most killer in North America today, by a long shot. Second is cancer. And so, what have we really done with the statin drug to help control heart disease? The real thing that will help us control heart disease is diet and lifestyle. And I keep harping on exercise because of that myokine stimulation and activation. I've talked about that on several episodes. But more importantly, diet. And more importantly, the Mediterranean diet. I mean, we hear about, the Mediterranean diet, oh my gosh, it's so amazing. It helps to deliver so much therapeutic activity. It's not therapeutic activity. It's more or less the Mediterranean diet supplying the building blocks and the basics that the body needs to function normally, voiding a lot of the toxins and a lot of the processed foods that contribute to dysfunction in terms of the metabolism. And so let's go back to the cholesterol anomaly. Statin drugs have been shown over a long-term study, and this is the Lancet, to reduce mortality in a large population by 30%. That's great. But the same study showcases the Mediterranean diet used by a larger group in this Lancet study, reducing mortality by 70%. 70%. And the reason for that is that the Mediterranean diet is full of polyunsaturated fats, fish oils, for instance, a lot of sardines, mackerel, salmon, a lot of fish. Processed foods are non-existent. The carbohydrate sources are usually whole. And you have a lot of vegetation supporting the microbial culture of the gut, the microbiome. So if we go back and then we talk about these blue zones that I mentioned earlier, blue zones are the places in the world where people tend to live longer than those in other places of the world. The blue zones have more of the centenarians, people that live to 100 or more, concentrated in these zones than anywhere else in the world. And most of these people live a very rudimentary lifestyle, Okinawa is one, and a lifestyle that's void of a lot of the first world toxins, poisons, byproducts, and processed foods and lifestyles. They grow their own food. They're always active. They're walking to their destinations. But there's another element that I began to study and didn't do a deep dive in, but started on it. And I hope to mention it here today to see if there's other people that may work into this epidemiological and geographical study. You go to Sardinia, the island in Italy. It's another concentrated blue zone of centenarians. We have a small area in California that also boasts a large group of centenarians. There's Costa Rica. Costa Rica is another blue zone. So it's kind of interesting to note another element of what happens in these blue zones. You have communities that are close. There's likely also a genetic component. The people are eating holistic foods. Almost everybody has a garden that they grow, so that keeps them physically active and creating highly dense, nutritious vegetation. But a thing I just did recently is I said, is it possible that the soils in these blue zones have higher density of nutrition? And I've not tested them, but what could be causing a higher nutrient density? And I thought, volcanic activity. And so when you look at volcanic activity that's been abundant over the last 300 to 500 years, and maybe even more, you start to superimpose that map, the search of that map, and then superimpose that on the blue zones, and you start to see that every blue zone is associated with significant volcanic activity. And that activity, I propose, then increases the nutrient density of the soil, changes the microbiome, and it produces elements that we're unaware of. We know that volcanic activity for the immediate term creates an acidic environment because of a lot of the ash and hydrosulfuric acid, and there's a lot of other compounds that may form a basis for acidity. But the fact is that over time, that is buffered, leaving behind an extremely dense soil, dense of minerals and other nutrients that we may know of and may not know of, allowing these plants to produce greater density of nutrition, but also their own polyphenolic compounds with higher density, maybe polyphenolic compounds with variables and variants that are different than we know because of the microbiome that will be different in that soil. And so nobody's really considered that element, but the fact is that the lifestyle, the community, and the diet. So this Mediterranean diet, if we forego the concept of higher nutrient density and just consider the high polyunsaturated fat, lots of olive oil. I grew up in an Italian family, and every single meal, some people in some cultures, they consume their salad before the meal. We consumed it after the meal. And every single meal had a salad that was abundant in vegetables and loaded with olive oil. And I have to tell you my personal experience from it. As I grew up in the family and got closer to competing in bodybuilding, I began to avoid a lot of the conventional Mediterranean dietary habits that included a lot of these oils, which I felt were unnecessary calories while I was preparing for these contests to get as lean as possible. And I think that thwarted my metabolism in a way that contributed to maybe a genetic predisposition that was there before, but allowed that to manifest into full-blown ulcerative colitis over time. The stress of training, the stress of a stringent dietary program that was carefully managed for calories versus protein intake, and then a lot of academic stress while going to school at the same time. A lot of things probably coincided. Nevertheless, I'll bet that if I had stuck to the pure Mediterranean diet that had the high fat content, a lot of the avocado, a lot of olive oil, flaxseed oil, and as an adult, I've gone back to that to maintain an extremely healthy life. But that's critical in maintaining cholesterol balance. So we'll circle back to cholesterol. That Mediterranean diet, regardless of cholesterol measurement, has been shown. And to reduce mortality and or morbidity by 70%, while in the same Lancet study I mentioned earlier, the statin drug reduced it by 30%. Statin drugs will reduce cholesterol synthesis in the body. And the way it works is that HMG-CoA is a rate-limiting enzyme for cholesterol production in the body. But the interesting thing is that when you take statin drugs, the statin drug will cross the blood-brain barrier. So you remember earlier we talked about cholesterol staying localized in the body and not crossing the blood-brain barrier to the brain, yet the brain producing its own cholesterol and housing 25% of your entire body's cholesterol, despite the fact that the brain is 2% of your body weight. So you take statin drugs to help lower body cholesterol, that statin crosses the blood-brain barrier to lower cholesterol production in the brain. And although cholesterol is required abundantly during fetal development and during infant development of the brain and central nervous system in general, that brain development and or turnover and recovery and restoration takes place throughout your lifetime to restore myelin, to restore neurons and the cell membranes and maintain them. And if it's not available, yes, you're going to develop cognitive deficits. And so the question is, do the statin drugs then contribute to cognitive decline with age? And we've seen an intensive increase in Alzheimer's disease in first world countries, while we've also seen an intensive increase in LDL cholesterol and a penchant, a voracity, an urgency to control that cholesterol with statin drugs, what's happening to the brain. Now, the one thing we do know for sure is that the same pathway that manages cholesterol synthesis also manages CoQ10 production in the body. And we do know irrefutably that if you take statin drugs, CoQ10 is depleted significantly. In fact, it's likely the thing that's causing the peripheral pain, because one of the side effects of the statin drug use is peripheral pain. And it's funny, I find it head shaking, in fact, that one of the solutions that I read about occasionally as a countermeasure for this peripheral body pain when using statin drugs is to avoid exercise. Huh? Well, exercise is probably your best way to help manage cholesterol and general health and reduce, the risk for mortality and morbidity. And so, avoiding exercise is definitely not a solution to the problem. Taking significant CoQ10 if you're going to use statin drugs, for sure. But we have to seriously consider, as a population, as a medical community, as the pharmaceutical agencies who manufacture a lot of these statin drugs and then advocate for their prescription, we've got to really seriously consider how this affects the brain. It's one thing to inadvertently shut down HMG-CoA production in the body, but it's another thing to allow that statin to cross the blood-brain barrier. And so I think there needs to be more research done to find ways of reducing general body cholesterol, peripheral cholesterol, while allowing the central nervous system to continue producing that cholesterol for brain turnover and other central nervous system neuron turnover. So this is critical. So this is why I come to you today and transition very quickly from the talk of cholesterol in general to the Mediterranean diet and what it means to general health. It means that Mediterranean diet can help you control cholesterol, help you control various parameters of cardiovascular disease by infusing the body with the metabolites through the microbiome and the compounds through the food itself directly, olive oil in particular, to help manage cholesterol in a way that's safe. If you do need statin drugs, maybe you usually need them for short periods of time, short bursts, because there are significant side effects and unknowns. I don't care if people say that there's knowns and it's reliable. There are unknowns. And I think it's important that you weigh the pros and cons when having to use statin drugs. A mismanaged cholesterol, not just elevated, but mismanaged proportions of your cholesterol components, HDL versus LDL, is definitely a bigger problem than just elevated cholesterol. And you want to make sure that that's managed. So in terms of the Mediterranean diet, that's something that you can look up. It's quite simple. We've got, whole grains in small quantity. You've got a lot of foods that come from the ocean. Anchovies. These are, and an interesting thing is that the foods that you see abundant in the Mediterranean diet, the fish, are sources that are extremely high in EPA and DHA, such as salmon, anchovies, sardines, mackerel, and these are high-fat fish. And I grew up with all that. And in fact, my kids grew up with a lot of seafood, and I personally would put very concentrated DHA, docosahexaenoic acid, which is the building block for the brain primarily, in breast milk and throughout their life. In fact, at 16 to 18 years old, my son is still taking 2 tablespoons a day. He may skip 3 or 4 days, but then almost every single day, it's 2 tablespoons today. Whereas when he was younger, it was 1 tablespoon. When he was even younger than that, at 4 or 5 years old, it was a teaspoon. He had probably close to half a teaspoon to a teaspoon in breast milk. And I think it's the way to go. I think that the DHA is itself not only a building block for the brain membranes, but it's also a ligand that triggers the body and tells it to build the brain. It tells the body that, hey, there's a lot of DHA available. Don't hold off on building the brain. Build the brain abundantly. And that way, if your brain is allowed to grow, if the central nervous system is allowed to develop when you're young, the body will allow the peripheral tissues to grow and develop at full capacity as well. If not, the body will say, hey, hold on a sec, let's stop building the periphery. Let's make sure the nutrients are available for central nervous system development, the brain. And therefore, that becomes the prevalent and primary objective of the body up to make sure that you're going to stay healthy lifelong and survive. But to make sure that you're getting enough DHA from the beginning is going to make sure that cognitive and peripheral tissue development is optimal for you throughout life. Going back to cholesterol, that cholesterol management needs to be something that you look at and consider through diet. Don't worry about cholesterol consumption in your diet. Worry more about saturated fat intake, which can increase the synthesis of cholesterol in the body. Worry more about trans fats in a lot of processed foods that will increase the synthesis of cholesterol in the body. Worry more about getting a lot of monounsaturated fats like olive oil. Monounsaturated fats will help to reduce cholesterol, but increase HDL, the good cholesterol that brings cholesterol to the liver for management. That monounsaturated fat is also shown to help manage blood sugar in the diabetic state. So the blood sugar spike that is often experienced after a meal, immediately after a meal, is actually desensitized and mitigated by the consumption of olive oil or the monounsaturated fat during or immediately after the meal, like in a salad. And so these are the kind of things that we need to be investigating, is what lifestyle factors do these successful centenarians apply. My grandfather, and then how do we apply those? My grandfather lived to 102, and I have to tell you that he came from these blue zone areas. In fact, it was not quite the blue zone, but southern Italy. And he would not, for the life of him, eat food out of a can. He grew his own food up until about 95 to 97 years of age, and only died because he fell, and this is common. It's a fall that's going to ultimately end your life at that age. And it was a fall that broke his hip. Whether his hip broke and he fell, or whether he fell and broke his hip, that started the end of his life. But he lived quite healthfully till about 101, staying away from processed foods. And I remember him distinctly being quite irate when he saw cans in our family's pantry. Why are these cans here? We have all this food in the garden, because we've always grown our own food in the garden as well. Nevertheless, I mean, these are the kind of things we have to consider. These are trial and true lifestyle habits of centenarians who have lived a life long past what we are expected to live today. Today, our lifespan, our expected, the expectation today is that we will live we will live fewer years than our previous generations lived. And it has a lot to do with the processed lifestyles that we live today, a lot to do with the fact that we don't engage in physical exercise, and the fact that we live in an environment that's quite stressful, that affects telomeres and the metabolism in a way that's very hard to compensate for. So we have to really look back and consider what our ancestors did, what the Mediterranean diet can do based on research that is significant and conclusive, and how we can change the course of health, including cholesterol management. Thank you.